Welcome to Feed Your Dog Facts, the internet's #1 resource for fighting pet food industry misinformation and promoting evidence-based pet care. Now, here are your hosts, Daniel Shuloff and Alexis Malone.
Hey, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Feed Your Dog Facts. Happy Friday if you are just tuning in. Dan, today we are talking about a book that you just picked up, although I just read that it was published in 2020. So a couple of years behind the
Basically, I read there was an article in the New Yorker about a more modern thing, which is people that eat all meat diets, what they call the carnivore diet. There's kind of a subset of the nutrition science community, a fringy subset that believes that eating all meat diet is good for your health. Fringy type vibe, right? Like it's kind of, that's out there. It's not a common thing. And so this investigative kind of science reporter from the New Yorker wrote a piece recently about that. And as part of that was like highlighting the context of that, like trying to put that diet into some broader social context, and talked about this other book that had been published a few years ago that we're going to talk about today called Eat Like the Animals, and how some of the findings from that book or the theory driving that book are somewhat inconsistent with the all carnivore diet. And so, yeah, that's how it came on my radar. But it's relevant to like pet care and doggy stuff for a kind of different reason.
And if you're just tuning in for the first time, that was Dan Shuloff. He is the CEO and founder of Keto Natural Pet Foods. He is also the author of Dogs, Dog Food, and Dogma. My name is Alexis Malone. I will be your host today. All right, all joking aside, let's get into Eat Like the Animals. Can you give us an overview of what you pulled from this book and why we are doing a podcast today on what macronutrients, difference between macro and micro? We'll also get into what are macronutrients, but what macronutrients do dogs choose? You know,
we as pet owners are typically making those decisions for our dogs. We get to choose what food to buy for them. We get to figure out how much of it we're going to feed them. And they, for the most part, I suppose there are people out there that give their dogs some elements of choice in there, but for the most part, they're going to eat what we say they're going to eat. Letting them figure out for themselves what they want to eat can be scientifically interesting for a variety of reasons. And so some scientists have done those kind of experiments where they take groups of dogs and they give them access to a lot of different kinds of foods that have different macronutrient levels in them, different amounts of fat, protein, and carbohydrate. And then they look at whether the dogs consume consistent amounts of different things, what they prefer, et cetera. And so we're going to be talking about that body of research and the significance of it, the ramifications that come from the findings over this show. Those type of experiments are central to this Eat Like the Animals book, which I'll see if I can get it. Usually my like blurry background thing makes it.
Logo here, so that way.
Oh, wow. Yeah, super. There you go. David Robbenheimer, Stephen Simpson, they're two biologists from the University of Sydney in Australia. The theory that they espouse in this book is called the protein leverage hypothesis. And what it says is that all animals have an internal barometer for the amount of protein that they're supposed to eat, that like evolution has developed them to eat, to need to preserve their health, to do all the things that their bodies are supposed to do, and to not develop chronic disease. That theory is borne out through research that these guys and a bunch of other folks have done on all sorts of different species. It's obvious, I guess, that different species will tend to consume different amounts of protein. Like think about a lion on the one hand, where it's eating it's just like those carnivore people, it's eating all meat and nothing else, very relatively high protein content, with say like a gorilla that's eating leaves and fruit like bananas and is eating much more carbohydrate than protein. So different animals need different amounts of protein, or typically consume different amounts of protein in the diet.
When we were talking off mic, one of the things that you said that I really liked was that your diet is a function of your environment.
In more ways than one, right? Like the way that it is that for the development of this theory and for the ideas put forth in this book is that like over generations, hundreds, thousands, millions of generations, evolution tends to shape your diet, your optimal diet, in a way that is consistent with your environment. If you don't have an ability to eat fruit because you live in the desert, your diet is not going to, over the course of generations, be optimized for fruit intake. If you needed fruit to be adaptive and genetically successful, population would move to a different place. Like what your biological needs are and like how you get calories out of potential sources of food are shaped by what kinds of sources of food are available, and it exerts selective pressure on each successive generation. They do better. The ones that are very well geared to pull nutrition out of the things they find in their environment tend to be successful and reproduce. And the ones that don't tend not to do well. And so over hundreds of millions of generations, that turns into diets that are optimized to ancestral environments. Like this is a process that takes a long time. And so you don't, over the course of 4 or 5 generations, turn dogs into nutritionally optimized to eat the foods that we are typically feeding them now. That process, the evolutionary process, hasn't had sufficient amount of time to exert pressures on them. But for other periods of their genetic history, their environment was incredibly similar for much longer periods of time. We're not talking about the 100 years that the modern pet food industry has been around. We're talking about like hundreds of millions of years of like similar type of food every day, that type of thing. And so over that period of time, they end up developing optimized diets that like reflect their environment.
And so when we dive into macronutrients, we're talking about 3 things specifically, which is protein, fat, and carbohydrate.
Right. They're the types of nutrients that contain calories. And so, that's what makes them distinct from like vitamins and minerals and water and other things that are components of nutrition. And so, what these guys did is they did like a whole cluster of different, these guys who wrote this book were also performed a lot of the studies that like informed their theory. And they did most of it on insects and on like laboratory rodents, because as you can imagine, it's just easier to develop data when you have these animals that require a very small amount of food, that have very short lifespans. You can like look at lifespan. They're much easier to kind of control. I suppose it's difficult to figure out, like to monitor how much of different nutrients like a locust is eating as compared to like a dog when you can just measure out the food. But other than that, it makes it a lot easier. And so they've done locusts and different kinds of like fruit flies and mice and rats, and all kinds of other folks have done this stuff too. And what they find is that the breakdown of one specific macronutrient, how much of one specific macronutrient tends to stay the same. When you give them the opportunity, when you give these animals, any animal, the opportunity to consume over a long period of time, whatever macronutrients it wants, they tend to always consume the same amount of protein. And that's the basis of this protein leverage hypothesis. It says that there is an internal, just like your feeling of hunger, but more nuanced, there's an internal guide that's essentially going to drive you to consume more protein until you reach that point where your optimized number is hit. And at that point, you stop feeling the urge to like eat protein. And it's basically, we often talk about hunger and satiety, like the feeling of fullness, as very monolithic concepts where it's not so much hunger for specific things, just hunger generally. I need food generally. And they put forth the idea that no, it's more than that. It's like you have different drives for different types of things, but particularly you have a internal thermostat that's governing whether or not you need more protein. And so whether it's locusts or mice, or as the case may be, dogs, we tend to see them consume the same amount of protein. Their diets tend to reflect the amount of protein that they really need. That theory, the protein leverage theory, has like really interesting ramifications. If you're optimized to take in a certain amount of protein, but you're living in an environment where the only foods available don't have as much protein as you are geared to want to consume, you will end up over consuming food. Like if, for instance, let's just pull a number out of the sky, 25%. Let's just say that you're a species, the Alexis and Dan species is like geared to consume 25% of its calories from protein. But it turns out that the only foods available to us are only 10% protein. Well, what you're going to do is you're going to continue feeling like you need more food even after the amount of total number of calories that you need in a day have been met, because you haven't gotten enough protein to reach your number. And so you're going to end up over consuming carbohydrate and fat and calories overall in an effort to try to catch up to the amount of protein that you have. And that's a recipe for many of the chronic disease problems that we see in both human beings and in dogs, particularly obesity.
Yeah, this is so fascinating to me because it completely plays into, I think not a lot of dogs are free fed where they just are left, a bowl of food out for the entire day. But it is so fascinating. Like I have worked with dogs as a trainer myself where the owner will free feed for, whatever reason. And the dog is now X amount overweight. And you have some dogs that are able to self-regulate really well. Not saying it has everything to do with diet, but I've never actually looked at the fact that just how big of a role that could play with owners who are free feeding their dogs and are
for sure.
Keep them at an optimal weight.
Yeah, an interesting that like kind of makes me think about wolves. I think that wolves really show me how powerful that self-regulation instinct can be. The mainstream thing about obesity is like, well, you need to measure very carefully. You need to make sure that you're giving exactly the right amount of calories every day, or else you miss it by just a little bit and you're going to wind up getting obese. You're making your dog obese.
Also, typically there too, my dog is still so hungry. They're acting so hungry.
Yeah, right. Wolf eats once every 10 to 7 days. Okay. Like never. They feast or famine type lifestyle where they take down an elk or whatever, and they eat an obscene amount, enough to get them through a really long period of time, like more than a week. But they eat like 10 to 12 pounds all at once. And it's just like, if they didn't have inside an internal regulator that was like doing a good job about making sure that they're driven to consume the right amount of the nutrients that they need, that would just like, it wouldn't work out. Think about like, it's hard enough to try to get your serving sizes exactly right when you're doing it twice a day, every day with the food that the calorie content of. Well, they're just not randomly, but like very rarely taking down a huge meal. And it just so happens that they do a very good job about eating exactly the right amount over the long run. To me, that's very consistent with how these guys think about protein. This book is written in a way, that's the idea is like trying to help people understand how these guys think people ought to eat in order to optimize their health. But it's got ramifications, just like, a lot of what we do on the show is like, well, the sophisticated side of the nutritional science community tends to be focusing on human related issues. And the much less sophisticated group tends to be the animal side. There's just not as much funding. There aren't as many people doing it. And the overall, like the level of the output is just much lower. And so you have to extrapolate the findings that apply in the human world to the doggy world to some degree. But they talk about, because folks have done these kinds of self-selection studies in dogs. And so they discuss them, and we're going to do the same thing.
And so when you say these self-selection studies, this is a group of dogs that have been selected. And the interesting thing that you mentioned earlier was that the breed didn't dictate the outcome, correct?
Not at all. Yeah, exactly. It's like dogs are hugely physically diverse, right? Like St. Bernard, 170 pounds, Chihuahua, 5 pounds or whatever. That's a ratio. The difference between 5 and 170, that ratio doesn't exist in like people. It's not like you have huge numbers of people that weigh 80 pounds and then a huge number of others that are 30 times bigger than that weigh 2,400 pounds or something like that. It's like dogs are incredibly diverse physically, but genetically, they're a single species. They're very similar genetically. And so they look really different. Their bodies are really different sizes, and they have different other like looks, obviously, different personality traits. But genetically, they're all much, much more similar than they are different. And so one of the ways that manifests is, when there's kind of two main studies that have been done where the researchers have given dogs the task of just like figuring out how much of different macronutrients they want to eat. And in one case, they intentionally we're looking to test this same idea. They were like, well, let's make sure that different breeds of dog, let's look at whether they have the same tendencies or not. And so they brought in 5 different breeds. They have Cocker Spaniels, Labradors, Papillon, St. Bernard, and a 5th one that I can't remember. I don't know if you have the abstract. You could probably pull it up. But yeah, they bring in these incredibly different dogs, and they found no significant difference in the ratios that they tended to consume, which is super interesting.
And so they bring in these 5 different breeds, and they put different diets in front of them, correct? And then just let them choose. And from there, each diet obviously has a different macronutrient content. So we're looking at high in protein versus low in protein, high in carbohydrate versus low. And so I'll throw out.
It's not like they're able to put each dog in a room with 100 different food products, each with just a little bit different nutritional content. Like in a perfect world, maybe you would construct the study something like that. In the real world, it's like they would at any given time offer them like 3 or 4 different options. And so, it's like that's going to shape your findings, right? Because like there's no 100% protein option. These are all both these studies have been done on commercial foods. And so like there's not a 100% protein option. There's not a 0% carbohydrate option. And so it influences the results to some degree, but that's not like doesn't render like the results like invalid, just kind of like worth noting. It shapes it.
And so for those of you that are watching, I'll go ahead and throw up both of the studies that we are currently referencing.
We should link them in the show notes too, because they're both like, if you go to PubMed or one of the other, like you can find these full text papers. They're both typically available for free. You won't have to pay. The one that's currently on the left-hand side of the screen, entitled Geometric Analysis of Macronutrient Selection in Breeds of the Domestic Dog, was the first of these 2 studies. It was carried out, presumed something like 2011. It was published in very late 2012. This is the one in which they had 5 different breeds of dog, all exposed to both dry and wet foods. They did a variety. If you look at this paper, it's like pretty in depth. They have like different phases. They did it in ways where like at first they would just give the dogs cold, free rein. Then they did another version where they gave them like a baseline diet and then gave them exposed to variable. But anyway, the main conclusion that comes out of it is really straightforward, that there's show what they call remarkable consistency in the ratio of macronutrients that the dogs ate. And the ratio that they found is that on a calorie basis, 63% of the calories came from fat, 30% of the calories came from protein, and only 7% of the calories came from carbohydrate. Yeah, that is notable for a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, before diving into them, it's like, remember that those numbers, that's not the same information that's being reported on the back of a bag of dog food. Like you'll see a fat percentage and a protein percentage and a carbohydrate percentage on the back of a bag of dog food, but they're not the percentage of calories. That's the percentage of the weight of the food. And that's somewhat different because different macronutrients contain different amounts of calories. So fat made up 63% of the calories in these dogs' diet. But fat contains more calories per gram than either protein or carbohydrate. It's rich in calories. And so relatively, like the fraction of the overall food that was fat is only something like 35%, although the total percentage of the calories was like 60+%. And so, and in addition, what's being reported here, 63% fat, 30% protein, 7% carbohydrate. Those are the only three sources of calories. But on the back of your bag of dog food, the percentage breakdown includes stuff that doesn't have any calories that's in the food too. So moisture, fiber, ash, in addition to those three. So this is not an apples to apples with the back of your bag where you're going to go, well, let me go look at what percentage of fat, protein, carbohydrate is in my dog's food, because then it's going to be misleading. It all works directionally in the same kind of way, though. So 63% fat, 30% protein, 7% carbohydrate.
I honestly would have guessed that protein would have been number one over fat.
So two things. One is, I think it is by weight the most. Fat contains more than twice as many calories per gram as protein does. So 63% fat is actually a smaller percentage of the overall food than 30% protein is. But secondly, we'll get to the second study in a second. It showed the findings there are interesting in a different kind of way, but they basically suggest that no, actually dogs want to consume even more protein than that. So in both cases, it's clear that the apple hasn't fallen that far from the tree. The dogs aren't that different from wolves yet. They're still very similar. Wolf obviously consumes being a carnivore, consumes tons of protein. But yeah, you see, some of the main takeaways are roughly the same amount of protein and fat and a very small percentage from carbohydrate. And that, of course, to anybody who's listened to this show before, that will know that is very inconsistent with what you find in the pet food aisle of the grocery store or in pet specialty retailer. Every single dog food sold by big producers like Purina and Hills are 30, 40, 50% dietary carbohydrate. And so that is definitely not what a dog will self-select for. It is notably less expensive than what a dog will self-select for, but it's not what they will tend to eat.
Okay, and moving into the second study, I'll go ahead and throw it up on the screen again here. And then if you'll just explain for those that are listening. Yeah,
they basically, I think the best way to describe the difference in these two is that they expanded the circle a bit in the second study. This one was published in 2017, so presumably done in something like 2016. And what they did is they watched their dogs over a longer period of time, and they gave them a broader selection of food products so that remember as I highlighted at the beginning, I was saying, well, you can only put so many foods in front of these guys in the real world. And because they're commercial products, you're going to be limited to some degree by what you can offer them. These guys tried to offer a greater variety of macronutrient combinations to their dogs. And more importantly, they watched them over a longer period of time, a period of weeks. And so they watched if and how things changed. And what they found was that there were changes over time, that at the beginning of their experiment, dogs tended to consume, they found basically the same ratio as the guys who did the first study, the guys and gals who did the first study. But over time, the relative amount of fat that they consumed tended to go down. The amount of energy that they got from fat tended to go down. That they kind of, in essence, started off by over-consuming fat. And then over time, that leaned out. But the amount of protein that they consumed stayed remarkably consistent. Think of it this way. It's like if the 63-37 ratio applies at the beginning, and then all that changes is you consume somewhat less fat over time. Even though you're consuming the same amount of protein, that percentage goes up and up and up. Do you see what I'm saying? Because it makes up a bigger fraction of the whole, because the whole has now lost some of the fat, some more of the fat, some more of the fat. And so what was only 30% of the calories at one point ends up being higher. And so that's what they found with these dogs, is that over time they consume somewhat less fat. And so the fraction of the calories in their diet that came from protein went from 30% at the beginning of the study to 44% by the end of the study. So they actually, and like I said before, that's not an apples to apples comparison to the percentages you find on the back of a bag of dog food. That's 44% of the calories that they consume. So it suggests that it's like more than 44%, like the back of the bag number there would be more than 44%. It would be north of 50%. So you're talking about protein contents that are high enough that they're at least rare in the modern pet food industry and potentially like impossible to find. There are very, very few brands that are selling 50+% protein. That's kind of crazy in light of this, right? Like that's what is, if you go to a garden variety kind of mainstream vet that's been drinking the Kool-Aid from their veterinary nutrition professor that taught them during vet school, what constitutes a high protein diet to somebody like that is way less than dogs will tend to consume if given the choice to take in whatever amount of protein they want. And so what I would say is that we've got a real problem in how we talk about the amount of protein a dog is eating. That when we think about high protein, what we're really talking about is way less than they really will consume if in a vacuum. It's way less than the amount that wolves will eat, but reasons outside of biology, we nevertheless refer to those as high protein diets.
That's so unfortunate that it's so taken out of context like that. It's like, of course, high protein for everything that's on the market, sure, but actually extremely low protein content when you look at the relevant science behind it. It's just baffling sometimes.
I mean, the thing is that in my experience, what tends to happen, I think, in a lot of nutritional domains is like the industry side of it comes along long before the science gets robust. And so what the norm in the pet food world is gets established, billion-dollar companies, whole industry, entire nation of people feeding their dogs kind of one way. Then interested scientists start doing work and they go, well, this thing we're doing is not great. And by that time, some little scientists just can't compete with the informational architecture that these huge companies have set up over generations and generations. And so it takes a long time for the common sense and the findings that come out of these studies to percolate in and take over for the preconceived notion of what is normal and therefore good. There's this really destructive idea in modern pet care, modern veterinary nutrition, which is that, well, what we're doing right now, what the norm is, don't mess with the norm. We know the norm is good. Feed a brand that has a long history in this country and is good. And it's so problematic for two main reasons. One is that argument doesn't work well unless you consider it on an evolutionary timescale. The idea that well, this has been around for 50 years is not persuasive unless we see that over those 50 years, dogs have gotten incredibly much healthier on a population basis. And so the second thing is, unfortunately, we've seen the exact opposite, that over the past 50 years, the public health of companion animals has gone through the floor. Obesity, diabetes, cancer, every chronic non-communicable disease that we see in human beings is now at epidemic levels in companion animals too. And so when somebody's like, no, status quo, go with the status quo, go with what's known. It's that's what got us here in this horrible situation that we're in. When somebody defaults to interesting study findings like the ones we're discussing with well, that's interesting, but it's so different than the norm, they tend to overweight the norm and not overweight the science. And that's no pun intended. It's a problem.
And so carbohydrate content between the two studies?
Always less than 10%. Always less than 10%. And wow. It's remember, as we've said on this show a million times, dogs have no nutritional requirement for carbohydrates. So one of the ways that we can think about what's optimal for them is to think about what they self-select for. If you believe, like these authors do, that there's an internal barometer, an internal regulator that's going to push you and your dog to consume the right amount of protein and other macronutrients, it's one way to think about what's optimal. Another way to come at the problem is to think about, well, what bad things happen if we take these nutrients out? If you don't get enough vitamin C, you get the disease scurvy. Scurvy is like the sailor's disease. The people, in the seafaring era, whereas like sailors were on the open seas for like, months and months at a time, and they weren't consuming any fruit or vegetable, they'd get scurvy, this really bad nutritional deficiency that was essentially being produced because they weren't getting enough vitamin C. There are similar diseases that dogs and cats and people will get if they don't consume enough protein, fat, calcium, whatever. There is nothing like that for carbohydrate. And so there is no nutritional requirement for carbohydrate. There is nothing that will happen to your dog that is a bad thing and a disease or a deficiency if you take the carbohydrate out of the diet. And so that's another way of thinking about what's nutritionally optimal. But yeah, it's the same. They lead to the same answer here. Like it's suggestive that there's wisdom going on like in the self-regulation. It's probably not a coincidence that there's no nutritional requirement for the thing that they don't want to consume that much of.
Makes sense to me. Okay, so recap. We have a Feed Your Dog Facts book club for those of you who would like to join, recommendations. So Eat Like the Animals. We'll put that in the show notes as well. And then going from there, these two studies are essentially telling us that when dogs are able to choose the macronutrients that they prefer high fat, high protein, little to no carbohydrate.
Yep, that's right. And then it's like very similar across breeds and across studies that like there is clearly something there. There is a regulation going on internally that's like there's enough consistency here where we can say with confidence that that's something that's going on.
And just a quick little side note, can you tell us what micronutrients are?
Yes, micronutrients are vitamins and minerals. There's stuff that you need in your diet, you take in through your diet, but in much smaller quantities. They're micro as opposed to macro than the fat and protein and carbohydrate that's measured in like grams. You're talking about getting just like milligrams, way smaller smaller quantities and weights of those things. But they're necessary in the diet to prevent development of deficiency diseases. So it's like vitamins and minerals.
Excellent. Well, Dan, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure. And
likewise.
Feel free to reach out to us at Feed Your Dog Facts if you have any recommendations for a label review that you would like to hear about, or just general topics. I know that we see a lot of studies that come out in the news, and we're always happy to break those down for you as well. So give us a shout out, reach out. Otherwise, we'll see you and talk to you guys next time.